And I'm so appreciative of everyone being on this for today. Really excited about what we're going to listen to, and especially for the next steps that come out of this. I want to turn it over to my friend and the one who really had this as his vision and has really done an amazing job pulling all of us together. So Clayton Sinai with the Catholic Labor Network, why don't you share with us, kind of as we begin to think about this, we want to hear the stories and we want to hear them. Particularly, we've asked Clayton to kind of give his theological framework for as we listen to the stories that we're going to be hearing. So Clayton, do you want to share with us?
All right, thank you very much, Bill, for your kind words. My name is Clayton Sinai, and as I mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Labor Network. The Catholic Labor Network is a national organization bringing together Catholic labor union activists with Catholic clergy, religious, and lay social ministry leaders committed to Catholic social teaching on labor and work. I've been asked to say a few words about why people of faith should be concerned about the fate of domestic workers. Speaking from my own tradition, more than a century ago, the Industrial Revolution was underway, and people were increasingly employed in dirty and dangerous jobs in factories at low wages. And this inspired the Church to analyze current events with the eyes of gospel values. And they reached certain conclusions. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued a letter called Rerum Novarum. In that letter, he set out some key principles. Every worker was a child of God, possessing human dignity. Every worker deserved a living wage, capable of supporting a family. Workers had the right to organize in unions and to seek just working conditions. Now, the Catholic Church was not alone in reaching these conclusions. Among many Protestant denominations, the social gospel tradition flourished, telling much the same story. Jewish rabbis reached similar conclusions about the economy and social justice. As a result, in the United States, in the 1930s, we passed some major laws to implement those conclusions. The National Labor Relations Act, giving workers the right to organize in unions, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, implementing a federal minimum wage. Unions and the minimum wage did a great deal to secure fair treatment for our nation's workers, putting our values into practice in the economy. There was just one problem, though. Those laws excluded domestic workers. Maids, cleaners, nannies, au pairs, all of these workers were left unprotected by the law. They remained vulnerable to exploitation, uniquely vulnerable because they often work alone under the exclusive supervision of their employer. That exclusion set a pattern and a precedent. Today, the DC human rights law, which protects workers from sexual harassment, excludes domestic workers from protection. So does its health and safety law. Today's domestic workers are fighting to change this, and we owe them our support. As people of faith, we all believe that every worker, no matter their job, has dignity as a child of God. And we start to honor that dignity by listening to them. That's why we're gathered here today, to listen and then to discern what we are being called by God to do in response. Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton, so much. I just appreciate so much the leadership of the Catholic Church historically when it comes to work on justice issues, particularly labor issues. But I love, as I'm looking over my screen, there's so many people from so many different walks of life and religious beliefs. And I think the beauty of justice work is that this provides the people directly impacted by injustice, provides a meeting point for all of us from all of our different worshiping experiences to come together to work for justice alongside those directly impacted. And I think there's nothing more beautiful than that coming together. So thank you for giving us a theological perspective. And I want to honor the many, many other perspectives that are brought to the screen. That makes us more powerful. And so I really am excited to turn it over to Antonia and Alana to share with us specifically how domestic workers are being impacted by not having a Bill of Rights. And I just want to say one thing real quick. I have found the National Domestic Workers Alliance to be one of my favorite organizations. They do absolutely amazing work. And Alana is one of their rock star organizers, and she's been incredible to work alongside of. And so I'm really, really excited to hear from Alana and especially Antonia. So Alana, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill. I am just going to say a few brief words and then we'll turn it to Antonia, who really is going to be the best part of this program. So but I just wanted to give a little bit of context, but first a thank you, because this group is giving me life, as they say. It's just a really beautiful group of people coming together, and we're so excited that you're coming. You took your time today to gather around this important issue. I'm sure you all know that's why you do this work, that faith leaders have such an important role to use your voices. So thank you again for being here. At NDWA, we like to say that domestic work is the work that makes all other work possible, because domestic workers care for the things that are most precious to us. Our homes, our children, our elderly loved ones. And so who are domestic workers? Domestic workers are overwhelmingly immigrant women of color. So just in DC specifically, over 92% of domestic workers are women, 91% are people of color, and 71% are immigrants. The number you see on the screen, 9,040, is the number of domestic workers who are working in DC, according to recent data. And the vulnerability that domestic workers face due to their gender and their race and their immigration status is compounded by the isolation of domestic work jobs, which are usually just one employee alone in a private home with their employer. There's no HR, human resources to turn to in case of a violation at work. And most domestic workers have no easy or accessible way to receive information about what their rights are on the job. Particularly because a lot of this work is done informally, without a contract or paid in the informal economy. There are very high rates of wage theft and other violations, including sexual harassment. You'll hear from Antonia, so many domestic workers talk about how they do their job really from their hearts, and that this is work that requires a tremendous amount of care, of skills, and yet we do a terrible job caring for those who care for us. It's not a coincidence that this work has always been devalued. It is precisely because this work has always been done by women of color that it has never been valued. And so I want to share a little bit about, very briefly, the history of exclusions here in DC. Clayton mentioned federal exclusions from federal law, but there's also in Washington, D.C., a pretty significant exclusion of domestic workers from the human rights law, which you'll hear more about in just a moment. But why did that happen? This history is really important. Enslaved women were some of the first domestic workers in the United States, and the exclusion of domestic workers from DC's human rights law, which is a key glaring relic of slavery that exists in our law, reflects this antiquated notion about race, gender, and what kind of work is real work. And so you heard about several key exclusions from Clayton from federal laws, where domestic workers, along with agricultural workers, were left out because lawmakers voting for these laws didn't want the overwhelmingly Black workers who were doing this work at the time to have the right to organize, to have the right to overtime and minimum wage. And these exclusions of farm workers and domestic workers became a sort of proxy for excluding Black workers generally from domestic work, because so many Black workers were doing these occupations at the time. And those federal exclusions trickled down to many, many state and local laws, including the human rights law in Washington, D.C. There's also been significant barriers because domestic work is done in private homes, and there's been a hesitance to create any laws that would impede on someone's privacy in their home, even though someone's home is a workplace when they employ domestic workers. And just specifically for the history in Washington, D.C., because I find it interesting, because Washington, D.C.'s government and laws were directly controlled by the federal government until 1973. Washington, D.C.'s laws particularly reflect federal laws and many of the exclusions that exist in federal laws. And so the exclusion at the federal level around protections against discrimination for domestic workers became part of DC's human rights law. And when DC gained home rule, the ability to have control over their own laws in 1973, the DC Council made no substantive changes to the human rights law. And so the exclusion continued, and it exists to this day. So Stephanie, you can go ahead and stop the slides. So I'm going to pass it to Antonia. And before I do, I just want to make sure that anybody who came late and is not a Spanish speaker has selected the interpretation button on their screen. I know a few folks came in late. Antonia is going to speak in Spanish, so make sure to look for the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and select the globe icon and click English, unless you are a Spanish speaker, so you can hear all of Antonia's powerful words. So thank you so much. And Antonia, I turn it to you.
Muy buenos días, todavía, o buenas tardes, ya son más de las 12. Muy buenas tardes a todos los componentes de la Ley Laboral Católica. Yo creo que voy a empezar por lo último de la carta en el cual me preparé muchísimo para llegar a cada corazón de ustedes. Voy a empezar por lo último donde había puesto que me siento muy feliz de saber que hay hombres y mujeres de fe que se suman a esta noble tarea justa de unirse a nuestros derechos para ganar los derechos que nosotros nos merecemos. Porque ahora veo que sí todavía existen Moiséses, ¿verdad? Que fue un gran líder que sacó de la esclavitud al pueblo de Israel, de Egipto, y que también hay Salomón, ¿verdad? Que fue un rey muy justo, que vio la igualdad y los derechos y que lo que le pidió a Dios fue sabiduría para poder entender y gobernar bien la nación o las naciones que en ese entonces le dejaba a Dios como herencia por su padre. Y me sumo también a mujeres, que veo mujeres que acompañaron en este rutín de caminar de la salida del pueblo de Israel hacia la tierra prometida como Miriam. Entonces, feliz de verdad de saber de que no estamos solas, que la Alianza Nacional de Trabajadores del Hogar no están solas y que hoy tenemos esta red de fe, esta red de amor para continuar. Bueno, mi nombre es Antonia Surco, soy de Perú, soy católica, en el cual cumplo con toda mi fe cristiana desde el bautismo hasta el sacramento del matrimonio, porque no solamente hay que predicar, también hay que hacer la acción. Soy proclamadora de la palabra dentro de la iglesia o de la parroquia que pertenezco. Actualmente también soy miembro de la Legión de María y vicepresidenta del Comité de la Hermandad del Señor de los Milagros en Wheaton, en la parroquia de Santa Catarina Laboré de Wheaton. Soy trabajadora del hogar. Desde que llegué a esta nación, que fueron hace 18 años. Me inicié como trabajadora del hogar por una cuestión de vocación que lo traía desde mi país y porque también fue al inicio una opción laboral, ¿verdad? Inmediata. Como todos los emigrantes llegamos a esta gran nación y lo más inmediato es trabajar cuidando niños y también muchos limpiando casas. En el proceso de este largo caminar, me di cuenta o tuve conocimiento de algo muy importante, que nosotras, las trabajadoras del hogar, no estábamos incluidas en la Carta de Derechos de la ley de Washington, D.C. Estábamos excluidas y la verdad que también en este proceso de mi vida, también opté por el cuidado de personas adultas. Porque entendimos que esta gran industria de trabajadoras, se debía a que los estadounidenses, las familias estadounidenses, trabajaban fuera de casa y no tenían con quién dejar a sus seres queridos, a sus seres amados por diferentes enfermedades de tratamientos largos como el Parkinson, como Alzheimer, como un cáncer, y que requerían de esta gran industria del cuidado de personas en sus propios hogares. Esa es la razón en la cual me involucro en estas dos grandes industrias, cuidado de niños y cuidado de personas adultas. Por ejemplo, muchos de mis clientes tuvieron muchos años de cuidado, como ya lo repetí, como el Parkinson, el cáncer, Alzheimer y otros, convirtiéndonos en ¿qué? En sus ángeles de la guarda y dándoles tranquilidad a sus familias que trabajaban fuera de casa. Grande mi sorpresa a los años de labor, tener conocimiento que nosotras, trabajadoras del hogar, estamos excluidas de los derechos humanos de la ciudad de Washington, D.C. Sabemos por historial, que ya me antecedió nuestra compañera Lana, que desde la esclavitud nos han dejado este legado, el no reconocimiento a esta labor tan importante y hermosa como es el de cuidar vidas humanas. Y mire, no tener la protección que nos merecemos por las leyes de Washington, D.C. es algo que extraña a todos. Esas son las razones por las que me involucro con los movimientos de migrantes y trabajadoras, específicamente hoy para las trabajadoras del hogar, con la Alianza Nacional de Trabajadoras del Hogar, y por eso soy ahora una líder del capítulo DMV, Washington, D.C., Maryland y Virginia. En este momento, la pandemia del coronavirus nos ha hecho ver y sentir realmente la desigualdad y discriminación en nuestros derechos como trabajadores y seres humanos. En lo personal, yo perdí algunos trabajos y no recibí ningún tipo de no recompensa, sino mis salarios, porque no era mi ausencia por motivos personales, era por la pandemia. Pero nosotros teníamos que seguir pagando alquiler de casa, seguir viviendo, seguir manteniendo una familia. Y no recibir ningún tipo de pago, ni siquiera una ayuda del gobierno federal. Cuando perdí mis trabajos, sentí realmente que estaba discriminada. Aún ofrecí a algunos jefes venir en un taxi para cumplir con todos los actos protocolares del cuidado. Sin embargo, muchos de ellos argumentaban que igual iba a tener contacto con un chofer, con un taxista, y eso podía yo traer el virus a la casa. Increíblemente, muchos de ellos recibían familia, visitaban también familias, y ellos podían ser los que podían transmitir también el virus o también contagiarnos a nosotros. Sin embargo, ellos solo pensaban que nosotros éramos quienes podíamos traer este contagio del virus, de esta pandemia que es todavía flagelo de la humanidad. Sin embargo, también tengo que dar testimonio, como ejemplo, de una jefa que yo iba muy esporádicamente a su casa a laborar cada 15 días. Al comentarle de esta discriminación de otros trabajos que estaba sufriendo, pues ella me pidió que fuera más continuo, que no fuera cada 15 días, sino que fuera cada semana con la finalidad de garantizarme por lo menos el pago del alquiler de donde vivía. Eso demostró de verdad que también todavía existen personas con sensibilidad humana para entender que este virus podría ser transmitido por ellos o por mí. Y así pasó unos meses atrás. Ella se había contagiado del virus. Ella no lo sabía ni yo. Cuando nos enteramos, cuando ella se hace un examen especial y me dice, Antonia, tuve el virus. Entonces también yo estaba a riesgo que ella me hubiera contagiado este virus. Sin embargo, yo no tenía un contrato escrito en el cual me garantizara que si ella me contagiaba el virus, yo iba a tener la protección necesaria para continuar laborando con ella y que no iba a ser un argumento como en muchos casos que por la cuarentena muchos no volvieron a su labor, como en este caso yo doy testimonio de ello. Porque muchos fueron argumentos solos, por favor, la cuarentena, hay que cumplir con el acto protocolar, pero ya no nos llamaron. Muchos no pudimos volver. No teníamos un acuerdo formal de que ella me dijera si tienes COVID, con la pandemia, de la pandemia, pues tú tenías el retorno asegurado o la remuneración de tu sueldo. Mas aprendí en esos momentos que este contrato es sumamente importante para todas las trabajadoras del hogar. Y también la necesidad de ser incluidas en esta Carta de Derechos de Washington, D.C. Una Carta de Derechos de las Trabajadoras del Hogar fue introducida por primera vez en el Consejo de Washington, D.C. hace 2 años y medio y no ha sido aprobado. Hace 2 años y medio esta carta fue recibida por el Comité Laboral, por la presidenta del Comité Laboral del Consejo, Lisa Siderman, quien ella iba a ser es nuestro sponsor. Y sin embargo, hasta el momento seguimos luchando por esta carta para que sea tomada en cuenta y podamos realmente sentir que nuestra voz es oída por ellos. Vuelvo a decirles que voy a repetir lo que habíamos escrito con un pensamiento de mucho amor a quienes nos iban a escuchar. Como creyente, me siento muy feliz que encontremos hombres y mujeres que se sumen, como Salomón, que fue un rey justo, como Moisés, que fue un gran líder libertador del pueblo de Israel, de esa esclavitud que hoy todavía vivimos en esta gran nación, los Estados Unidos. Y que podemos empujar juntos a esta petición de los derechos, que es justo y necesario que en este siglo todos seamos tomados en cuenta, porque el trabajo laboral que hacemos es un trabajo como cualquier otro. ¿verdad? Es un trabajo y tan importante, tan humano, con tanto sacrificio, que damos nuestras vidas en muchos casos. Cuidar un bebé recién nacido es muy importante y también las personas adultas. Entonces nos vamos a quedar, un eslogan que habíamos dicho con Alana, nos vamos a quedar con este gran mensaje. Empecemos a mejorar la calidad de vida humana y empecemos por los derechos de las trabajadoras del hogar. Gracias por haberme oído este testimonio. Gracias en nombre de las casi 2,5 millones de trabajadoras del hogar que son parte de esta gran nación, los Estados Unidos. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Antonia, for your powerful words. I want to make sure we have time for you all to ask Antonia questions. So I'm going to very briefly share a little bit more about this Bill of Rights that you heard so much about and the status of this campaign. But not more than a few minutes, so you can be in conversation with Antonia for the rest of our time. So you heard Antonia talk about a DC Bill of Rights, and as she said, a domestic workers Bill of Rights was first introduced in the DC Council in September of 2019, and we've been fighting since then. The current legislation that we are hoping to see introduced soon in the Council of DC has 4 parts that you see on the screen in front of you. Here's what the bill would do. It would include domestic workers in DC's Human Rights Act so that they have protections against employment discrimination. It would also include domestic workers in DC's occupational health and safety law, from which domestic workers are also excluded. It would require a written contract between domestic workers and their employers. And you heard from Antonia what an important tool is this written contract is to make sure domestic workers know their rights and can actually enforce their rights when there is a violation at work. And the last thing the bill would do is to create an outreach and education program to make sure domestic workers know their rights and employers know their responsibilities under the law. Right now, as I mentioned, we are waiting excitedly for this bill to be introduced this DC Council period by Councilmember Alyssa Silverman, who has committed to introduce and champion this bill. We hope that we will see it introduced within the next few months or even sooner. And we're hoping to have this bill pass the DC Council before the end of the year, before their DC Council period ends at the end of 2022. So you can go to the next slide real quick. There are so many ways. If you're going to ask a question of what can you do to help, I want to preempt that question and tell you right now, there are a lot of ways that we would love to have your voice in support of this issue. This PowerPoint will be sent out afterwards, so don't worry about writing this down. But this website has a lot of information about this campaign. Specifically, there is a letter that the Festival Center is organizing for faith leaders to say that you support a domestic worker bill, and we'd love to have you put your name on that letter. We'll send information in the follow-up about how to do that if you're not already on that letter. There's a petition you can sign and forward to all your friends, post on your social media. You can write a letter to Councilmember Silverman. That would make a huge difference, telling her how much you are excited to see this bill be introduced as soon as possible and the need is urgent. Either Clayton can work with you to write a letter, or there's a form letter that you can edit at this link. We are organizing, by we, I mean Bill and Clayton are organizing a meeting directly with Councilmember Silverman herself for faith leaders. And so we'll share more information as soon as we have a date for that meeting. So you can speak directly to the council member and tell her why you and your community care about this. And if you want to invite us to your church, we're happy to come and speak to your congregants about this issue. So we can take the slideshow down. And with that, I'll turn it to Bill and to Clayton to facilitate a chance to be in conversation with Antonia.
Thank you, Alana, so much. And again, we will be sending out all the links and the letters and everything else. We'd love to, the letter has close to 40 faith leaders. We'd love to push that up close to 50. And that would be a really, really strong letter to send her. But let's open it up. If you have a question, especially for Antonia or for Alana, we want to entertain your questions. Anything that we can help to clarify this issue so you understand specifically what Alana presented and how that impacts or could impact people like Antonia. Michelle, yes.
Just a quick factual question. Is the text of the bill available at the link that you gave? I took a quick look at the website. Where is the text? Thanks.
Yeah, we don't yet have full legislative text to be shared of the bill, but if you go to that website, it says download a summary, and there's like a one-page fact sheet that talks about what's in the bill.
Okay, thank you.
So you're saying Councilmember Silverman is still preparing the bill?
Yes, exactly. The staff who work on the DC Committee on Labor and Workforce Development, who work for Councilmember Silverman, are working on finalizing the legislative text right now.
And I think our meeting with her will be to thank her for her leadership and to emphasize that there are lots of communities that are ready for her leadership to really take an active stance on the bill to move this forward. Is that correct, Alana?
May I ask a follow-up?
Please do.
So is part of the engagement with Councilmember Silverman to try to shape what ends up being in the text of the bill? Are there specific things that you want to make sure are in there?
That's a great question. I will say that the 4 components of the bill that I mentioned come from conversations with the members of the DC chapter of the National Domestic Workers Alliance about what protections are essential and important to them at work. And so I think it would be great to have allies like everybody here echo the importance of those provisions, because that's what domestic workers have told us they need at work, or at least some of the things they need at work, not everything, certainly. So I think the engagement with Silverman is really to show her that there's a broad group of stakeholders who care about this issue beyond just domestic workers themselves, and to convey that there's some urgency to this issue and that we're excited to see her act as soon as possible. So more so that than changing specific provisions or encouraging her around specific provisions. But you can know that what's in the bill came from domestic workers.
I have a question for Antonia, if she's willing to take it. It's my understanding that the DC human rights law is where you go to complain about sexual harassment. Can you tell us anything about sexual harassment of domestic workers and whether that's part of their work experience and what you've heard from others as well as from your own experience?
Ok. Sí, tenemos grandes testimonios de mujeres que han sufrido acoso sexual. No quiero decirles yo personalmente. Normalmente he trabajado, como les digo, en la gran industria de cuidado de niños y cuidado de personas adultas, ¿verdad? Con diferentes enfermedades, y más que todo en trabajos de limpieza de casa ha habido casos de acoso sexual, porque muchas veces pues se tiene que entrar a un dormitorio, se tiene que entrar a un baño a limpiar. Muchas veces uno entra a las 8 de la mañana a laborar cuando todavía hay una persona varón de repente alistándose, cambiándose, saliendo de la ducha, y tenemos casos donde muchas veces pues desde el baño, tráeme tal cosa, lo necesito. Entonces sí sí hemos tenido indicios de ello y por eso es que nosotros estamos pidiendo esta protección, ¿verdad? Esta ley, el cual nos permita, por ejemplo, en Maryland existe esta protección, pero dice que usted puede hacer una demanda por acoso sexual o otros cuando hubieran 14 personas laborando en ese lugar. Normalmente cuando uno va a trabajar en una limpieza de casa o también un cuidado de niños o de adultos, pues es una persona o dos. Entonces, esta protección estaría dándose más para una empresa, para algo más grande donde hubiera 14, 15 personas a más trabajando. Pero para nosotras, las trabajadoras del hogar, no. Ahora, hay que ver de que babysitters, nannies que son para niños más grandes, cuidado de personas adultas, ya le digo que hay tratamientos muy largos que uno tiene que quedarse solo con la persona enferma, ¿no? Y a veces entran y sale el hijo o el esposo por razones de volver del trabajo. Entonces, sí, siempre estamos en un riesgo de poder sufrir este tipo de actos que no van, y por eso es que necesitamos esta protección, estar incluidas en la ley de derechos. No sé si mi respuesta ha sido clara.
Antonia,
Yeah, Dora, go ahead.
thank you. Antonia, yo quería hacerle una pregunta para ver si usted podría darnos, si es que ya hay un modelo, por ejemplo, de contrato entre la persona, ¿verdad?, la trabajadora y el patrón. Si hay un modelo de contrato que ustedes consideran que es algo que es lo ideal. ¿Hay algunos elementos de ese contrato que tal vez usted podría compartir con nosotros?
Sí, por
Gracias.
supuesto que sí. Incluso yo creo que Alana podría ponerlo en pantalla, uno de nuestros modelos que lo hemos debatido en los diferentes comités, ¿verdad? Porque no es algo que nazca de la alianza, es algo que nace de nosotros, como los puntos que creemos elementales. Lógico, estamos pensando siempre en el empleador también y tanto en nuestra protección, ¿verdad? Y nosotros más lo que buscamos es esa seguridad de que tenemos derechos ganados como trabajadores. Y igual que una compañía, una empresa grande tienen derechos, no estamos pidiendo más, ni siquiera estamos pidiendo un derecho de vida, un seguro de vida. Simplemente pedimos, y Alana, por favor, si podrías mostrar esa carta, ese modelo, el cual podrían tener, cómo hemos trabajado tantos años en este tipo de modelo. Por favor, Alana.
Mil gracias, Antonia.
Muchas gracias a usted.
Yeah, I don't have it available to share right now, but when we send an email with the presentation after, I can share that. And I can say that many other states have adopted written contracts for domestic workers, Massachusetts, Nevada, Seattle, Philadelphia. So there's a lot of good models out there. And this is something that even before we hopefully make it a requirement in the law, is something that if you employ a domestic worker, if you know someone who employs a domestic worker, you can use model contracts, even if there's no legal requirement yet, with your domestic workers. So you know what kind of rights they should have in the workplace. Because a lot of employers of domestic workers, they're an individual, they're not a business, and they don't know what rights a worker should have. And the model contracts can help give you a guide to that.
Thank you, Dora, for that question. Rob.
Yeah, related question to that. It's helpful to know that other jurisdictions have done this. And I wonder, seeing the people who employ domestic workers as a significant constituency and potential obstacle, what have efforts looked like, if any, to engage them, to get them on board, to get, voluntary compliance going? And, it seems like in my own community, like a really good way to sort of like call people in on privilege and do your practices align with your values? And I'd be interested in resources best practices around that if you have them.
Yes, we completely agree that employers of domestic workers are a key constituency to organize. So we work very closely with an organization called Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network, and their whole purpose is to organize employers of domestic workers in support of the rights of domestic workers. So I'm putting their website in the chat, and they are working very closely with us on this campaign. So if you know of an employer, someone who hires a nanny, a cleaner, or you are an employer, we have an organizer at Hand in Hand who can specifically work with you to develop testimony as an employer. And if you go on that website that I put in the PowerPoint, there's a petition specifically for employers that says, I'm an employer and I'm signing this petition as someone who hires a nanny, a house cleaner. So, but their website is also full of tons of resources, like what's a fair work contract? What should I think about when I hire a house cleaner during COVID? How do I treat a nanny fairly during COVID? So their website has tons of resources for people, for employers who want to do the right thing, because there are a lot who want to do the right thing. And we want laws, but we also want people to easily be able to treat their workers well by choice. And so I would highly encourage you to look at their website. It's full of good resources.
Excellent. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Alana, for sharing. We're down to the last couple minutes. I did want to real quickly cover one thing. One of the things I really appreciated from Antonia's sharing was her theological reflection and her sharing the faithfulness of her life at church. And it just reminded me, domestic workers are not people that we're detached from. They're in our faith communities, and many times I would love to know, even just with a show of hands, did that resonate with anybody else on here? Were you thinking of people in your own faith community who, like Antonia, they're faithful members of your faith community and they attend your house of worship? And they work during the day in someone's home as a nanny or as a caregiver of some. Just a little wave I would love to know. Oh, it's so encouraging, isn't it? I love seeing that. And so I want us to think, as we move forward, not just we want to encourage Councilmember Silverman to introduce the bill and to really take a really active leadership on the bill, but we're going to need help getting this through hearings and getting this through the whole legislative process. So we'll be calling on you for your help throughout the process. And I hope that you'll be reflecting on, as Antonia has led us, to think through theologically why this is important, and relationally the people who make this important in our lives, and those are the people in our faith communities. So that makes for incredibly powerful testimony before a hearing that oftentimes gets boggled into all kinds of obscurities. So I just want us to be thinking of those stories that we can share. Clayton, anything, you have any final words for us, or Alana, before we sign off?
I do not. I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of their day today to come out here. And I will be following up with a lot of you afterward about what we can do to support Antonia and Alana in their campaign.
Thanks, everybody, so much.
Thank you.
Blessings on you and your ministry, and we'll be in touch.
So Clayton, you will be keeping us informed of the next steps, right?
I will.
Okay.
You'll hear from me soon. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
for
Nice
being here
meeting
today.
everybody.
So great
Good to meet you,
have
Ann.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.